Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the cEDH cast. My name is Ian, and with me as always is my co-host Braden.
Hello!
As you may have noticed, I have escaped from the bowels of the Gitrog monster. It was not easy, and it recently became my assassin's trophy. Now, we are going to be talking about today a very interesting and dynamic topic. We're going to be talking about politics in cEDH. But before we get to this great topic, we have a patron shout-out. Braden?
All right, our special patron this week is Michael Hundley. Michael Hundley is a $1 patron. So thank you, Michael, for all of your wonderful donations. You've been a patron for about 2 months now, so thank you. And we're really excited to have you on as part of our patrons. And we hope you stick around, and we hope we make content that's worthy of your donations. So thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciate the support from everyone out there in the community, and we really appreciate all the work that people have done to show us that support, whether it's retweeting stuff, subscribing on YouTube, or being as generous as giving us money on Patreon. So thank you so much. And we may have, after talking with our quarterly level patrons, our patrons who get to attend our quarterly meeting, we have some new developments and things that we are working on as a team coming up. So thank you to those patrons specifically. Mm-hmm. Moving on, we are going to talk about our main topic, politics in competitive EDH. So, Braden, the first topic you had written down here is, do politics exist in cEDH? I know my answer to this question, but what's your general opinion on it?
All right, so this is probably used to be a hot take, but I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I think over the course of the years, I think that what the definition of politics is has definitely changed quite a bit. And I think as there's been a shift from what politics looks like on the Command Zone podcast or in game nights to what politics looks like on Playing with Power or, casually competitive or in when we play on Cockatrice. They're very different. And it took a long time, I think, for the community to realize that the other thing we were doing was also political in nature. It's just a very different expression of those muscles.
Right. Whereas politics and casual Commander tend to be more things like, oh, don't swing at me if I do this for you. They tend to be for example, business deals. Whereas I've noticed politics in cEDH tend to be a lot more of pointing out what the right play is at the right time for you, if that makes sense.
It's about manipulation and attention. And so one trick I do quite often when I play in paper is I will pick up a card I think is hurting me quite a bit, but not obviously, and I'll drag attention to it, especially when someone's about to cast a removal spell. When I can tell someone's eyeing up this removal spell in their hand and looking around the board, I'll pick up a card and say wow, this is really good, and then I'll put it back down. And I don't know if anyone notices that. I mean, some people do. My friend Jacob's pretty smart about that stuff, but most people don't. And so, a lot of the times, for some reason, that removal spell targets that permanent I held in my hand for a bit. So politics can represent itself like that quite a lot of the time, I've found.
Yeah, and one of the things is when you are playing a 4-person game, right, you don't always have the answers. It would be nearly impossible for you to play police at a table. You're just going to run out of resources, right? So sometimes you have to use the other players as an extension of your arm, right? Think of it like a tennis player using a racket. Your other players in the game can be your racket at times.
We were talking about mental misstep in cEDH on Reddit. And someone mentioned, I can mental misstep my opponent's turn 1 Soul Ring, and they're just dead. And I responded with, well, sometimes you don't want to kill your opponent, because your opponents are just a resource. Just like any other resource in the game, the cards in your opponent's hands are also a resource. And sometimes they're used against you. So of all the resources in the game that aren't yours, a third of those resources are also targeted towards people you want to be targeting. So the more consistently and effectively you can access those resources, the better you're going to be able to get ahead, or at least stay in the game, or disrupt whatever disruption those two players are also playing.
And sometimes, talking with your opponents can create the environment where you're okay, now because we've pooled our resources together, we can answer a threat that maybe you wouldn't be able to answer at times. For example, sometimes you're going to have something like a deflecting swat in your hand, and you can't counter a Seedborn Muse that way, but what you can do is counter the spell that your opponent is going to cast to try to counter the counterspell that one of your other opponents cast, right? So you can talk to your opponents and work in that way, so where you're helping each other together, right? By using resources that you don't have, your opponents can actually be assisting you while also furthering their own goals.
Yeah. What we're talking about right now actually transitions really well into one of the topics we wanted to talk about. And that is, and we kind of touched on it a bit, but you have 3 opponents. And what that means is that you have 3 different teams that you're playing with in every game of cEDH you're playing. So when I say a team, I mean there's a team of 3 people who are trying to prevent each player from winning. So you have 3 opponents. And if you think of that as a team, those 3 people are going to be interacting with you and disrupting you as you try to win the game. For each other player, it's the same way. So you have 3 different teams you're always on, and it's your job to make sure that each of those teams are disrupting the opponent that all 3 of you on that team have in common in such a way that also allows you to further your own game plan.
Yeah, right. So a coherent example of that is, hypothetically, let's number each player at the table, right? Say you are player number 1. At any point in the game, your team can consist of player 1, 2, 3, player 1, 2, 4, or player 1, 3, 4, right? That is, at any time, any of those combinations can be the people you are aligning yourself with to stop someone else winning the game.
That happens a lot with quite a few different cards, which we're going to be covering in just a bit. But I think it's important that we make it like kind of clear what does this like really mean. So I think we're gonna use just one of the examples, which is Hermit Druid. When you're playing against Hermit Druid, you have to share a lot of different information, right? If you have a silence in your hand, you're going to want to tell your opponents you have a silence, because that silence, a silence in response to Hermit Druid's activation, can prevent the Hermit Druid player from even being able to win the game that turn. But a silence in response to a Dread Return isn't going to do anything, because that Dread Return is just going to reanimate the Thassa's Oracle, and they're going to win the game. They don't need to cast a spell once they've cast Dread Return, most likely. So you need to communicate, hey, and you need to be careful about how you communicate it, but you need to communicate, I have an answer that only works in this right now, or in response to a trigger. So, for example, Narcomoeba is a trigger, right? Maybe you want to respond to the Narcomoeba trigger with a silence. You need to communicate what options you have in that moment, because if you don't, the small, narrow pathway that you might have where interaction is open and viable could go away. For example, I was playing a game against a Hermit Druid player a few weeks ago, and they had to untap one of their lands with a, what's the name of that zombie that untaps permanents?
Fate Stitcher. I believe this was me.
Yeah. Was it?
I believe I am the Hermit Druid player you were speaking of.
Yeah. So I was playing against Ian, who was on Hermit Druid, and I recognized that the land, in response to the land untapping, was probably our last moment where we could properly interact with the resources I felt that our team had. The other players on the team didn't agree and waited until the very last minute to respond. At that point, the extra mana meant that Ian was able to protect his combo, and he ended up winning the game. I think we streamed that game, actually, so people could go back and watch it. I remember being quite frustrated, which is, why that sticks out so strongly with me. But you have to recognize, like, in situations like that, and I think the people we were playing with failed to recognize that I was offering up all my information, and it was in their best interest to comply and also offer up information, because if they didn't, we would die. And we ended up dying because of it. Yeah. I think that's a very strong example of when you should be sharing information. And I think it also kind of displays what kind of information you should be sharing, what counter spells you have, what removal spells you have, what kind of niche stuff you have. A Noxious Revival would be very powerful, but if you Noxious Revival at too late of a time, Ian can just shuffle things back in and start over in just a couple turns.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is there any other information you think is commonly shared in these situations?
So definitely, as I mentioned before, that idea of like sharing what pieces you have. So for example, one that I see a lot especially when I'm doing like ranked games on the Nexus, when everyone's really like playing as optimally as possible, is someone will say, can you deal with X threat on the board? And I'll say no, but if you do something, I can back you up. Meaning, like, say I have a delay and a Veil of Summer in my hand, right? I can fight the counter magic used by that opponent. But no, I don't have, for example, there was a Consecrated Sphinx on the board the other day. I did not have swords or Red Elemental Blast to deal with the Consecrated Sphinx, but I had a delay and a Veil of Summer up. So I said, hey, opponent, if you have an answer, I can back you up here. Wait till my turn, let me untap so I can fight over this for you, and we're not going to lose to this one card on the field.
Yeah, that's very common.
So there are a number of cards. Braden and I actually both end up giving an example a little early on this one, but there are a number of cards that are so aggressively leaning towards winning the game that they warrant a lot of political discussion at the table to stop them. The 4 we have highlighted here are Hermit Druid, Ad Nauseam, Underworld Breach, and Seedborn Muse. Now, we did talk a little bit about Hermit Druid. There are certain steps, and because that card tends to come down within the first 2 turns of the game, it does have that effect of, okay, now we need to answer this as soon as possible.
Yeah, one thing we didn't address earlier that I just realized is because Hermit Druid comes down so early, part of the political discussion has to happen the moment it resolves. Because it takes a whole rotation for Hermit Druid to come back around and win the game. And in that time, players have to be willing to not tap out to play more of their game plan. So, you know, tapping out for a Signet doesn't make a lot of sense when a Hermit Druid just resolved if you have interaction for the Hermit Druid.
Exactly.
So that's another good example of something you might see with just Hermit Druid.
I was in a game earlier actually where I had an opponent fight over a Smothering Tithe. I had an active, so it wasn't a Hermit Druid, it was actually a food chain. I had a food chain out, and it was everyone was hyper aware of the fact that if it got back to my turn and I resolved the food chain, I had a creature in exile, I had enough creatures on the board, nothing could stop me if it got back to my turn, and I resolved that food chain. But one of the players got greedy, tapped out for a Smothering Tithe, and the other opponent couldn't have the Smothering Tithe around if they survived the food chain. So they ended up countering that Smothering Tithe, and now they had been down 2 resources. And because we were in such an early stage of the game, it was only like turn 3 at this point. Now, because everyone had taken the greedy play and moved forward instead of working together as a unit to try and stop that food chain resolving, I just untapped on my turn and won without any hassle.
And I'm just going to list off these cards again because one thing there's something I really want to cover about them. So they're Hermit Druid, Ad Nauseam, Underworld Breach, and Seedborn Muse. Something all these cards have in common is they dodge specific removal. So Hermit Druid's a bit of an edge case. It's so fast that it kind of creates its own political situations.
Yep.
But Ad Nauseam, Underworld Breach, and Seedborn Muse. Ad Nauseam doesn't get hit by bounce spells or removal spells. It's not a permanent. So you can't like Assassin's Trophy and Ad Nauseam.
Exactly.
So that means that a lot of the common removal in the format is dead against it, especially in permanent heavy metas where they're reliant on Seedborn Muse or Paco or some other value mid-range piece. So that requires the table to have to be very honest with each other about what they have, because you need to be very careful with that card, because if it resolves, it loses. And a lot of the cards that people have to answer threats in this format are dead.
Right.
The next one's Underworld Breach. Underworld Breach notably dodges Dispel and Flusterstorm, which are very powerful counterspells in our format.
Right.
But additionally, once it resolves, it protects itself.
Yes.
So any counterspells that are in the graveyard are suddenly accessible.
Yeah, as soon as it resolves, there is almost no point in the fight anymore. Like, it is 100% over. It is. There are definitely times where your opponents whiff very hard, but like 9 times out of 10, they are resolving an Underworld Breach with like 7+ counter spells still in their graveyard, just ready to fight it. So it's definitely one of those things where people have gotten greedy, and I've seen it before where they try to let the breach resolve and fight afterwards, and it doesn't work.
Yeah. So communicating in response to that breach is important. Definitely. There's also things where you might want to talk about, like, what do we expect them to do with the breach? Do we expect them to cast a brain freeze? Do we have a response for the brain freeze?
Yeah.
In response to the brain freeze, can we blow up the breach?
Yeah.
Things like that. Maybe after casting a couple spells, they don't have any protection left in their graveyard.
Right. You
do need to have a conversation where you ask people, like, how much are we fighting over this?
Right, definitely. And so, for example, say you are sitting there with an Abrupt Decay in your hand, and the breach comes down, and you know that your opponent's first move, because of the way their board set up, is cracking their Lion's Eye Diamond. You're not going to want to fight on the stack over that breach. You're going to want to make sure that that breach resolves and your opponent gets crippled and out of the game at that point, right? So it's being able to communicate that to your opponents with also not making the person resolving the breach aware. And how do you come about those conversations? So Braden, for example, in that scenario I just granted you, if I'm one of your opponents who is not resolving the breach, how do you communicate to let it resolve? What would you normally say?
So this is an interesting question. Like, if I have the Abrupt Decay in my hand, it entirely depends on what I see my opponents doing. So, and it also depends where we are in the game. So in some games, I want my opponents to have as much interaction as possible, because I know I'm not the target of that interaction, and I know that I can win the game without playing anything that needs to be interacted with, which not a lot of decks can do, but like Medium Green can absolutely do that.
Right.
Medium green can like just activate Thrasios until they win. So let's say I was playing a Thrasios deck, like which is like one of the decks I play that does play Abrupt Decay. I might just say, hey, I'm going to let my opponents fight over this. I know I have the answer to it. I know that with the line they're going for, the Abrupt Decay is the answer. And I want my opponents to have less interaction. So when it comes back to my turn, I can just finale for Seaborn Muse or finale for Thassa's Oracle and win the game. However, there's times where I'd want my opponents to have interaction because there might be an Urza player coming up next. I want the Urza player to not be able to resolve a Winter Orb or a Power Artifact that we know about.
Right.
In that situation, I might say, hey, everyone, before we do anything, I have this Abrupt Decay. I'm going to use the Abrupt Decay. We can fight over this Transmute Artifact or this Power Artifact that's coming on the stack next turn.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I'd offer that information. It really depends on what's coming up. Some decks want your opponent. Sometimes you want your opponents to throw out all their interaction and fight over everything, and sometimes you don't. So the last example we have is Seaborn Muse, and Seaborn Muse is also interesting. It not only dodges Dispel, Flusterstorm, Negate, Force Negation, Fierce Guardianship, Deflecting Swat.
Yeah.
It dodges basically anything but removal. There's Force of Will, but you only get one Force of Will.
You only get one, exactly. And Mana Drain.
And Mana Drain, yeah. That's in delay. There's about 3 playable counterspells, but they're not always going to have those. Right. And so the thing you have to be aware of when you're fighting against the Seaborn Muse is if you have that hard counter, you have to be the one who uses it most of the time. And you can try to bait it out. You can try to like maybe do some priority bullying, but at the end of the day, if you're like near the end in priority, if you're second or third in priority, and you see the Seaborn Muse on the stack and you have the counterspell,
right?
You should probably ask the table like, what do we have here? Do we have removal spells? Do we have counterspells? You might even feel comfortable saying, I have the counterspell, but I think he's going to be able to back it up with protection, and I don't want this. I don't want the Mana Drain to get Dovin's vetoed, for example, right? So you might say something like that. But if they have a Deflecting Swat, the Dovin's veto doesn't matter. Things like that. It depends on how much information you have, and how specific your political conversations can go. But those might be some of the things that are on your mind.
And that's another case where, so say hypothetically, you have a Swords or an Assassin's Trophy in your hand. Seaborn Muse is another case where you can tell your opponents, like, don't worry about fighting over it now. Let it resolve, and we'll fight over it when I go to remove it. Right? Exactly,
and especially because like a Veil of Summer doesn't do anything against the Sword Splashers.
Exactly.
Right. If you know what they have, or they have a few cards in hand, or they keep holding up a green mana.
Yeah,
it's a thing you see a lot. Like if someone floats a red mana off of a Carpet of Flowers, or they have the option of holding up like blue black or blue red, and they hold up the blue red. It's like usually okay, they're holding up the Pyroblast, and so you might. You might try to play things that don't get hit by Pyroblast.
Exactly. Now, before we move on to our next subtopic, I think we're going to take the time to cut to an advertisement. This week, we are sponsored once again by Graphic Ginger, and we're going to hear about his webcomic, Starcrossers. Our sponsor for this week is the indie webcomic, Starcrossers.
In a universe at war, 2 soldiers adrift in the endless sea of space collide. Can they find love crossing the stars together, or will a horrible realization tear them apart?
Starcrossers is a sci-fi romance webcomic written and illustrated by Michael Tortora for the Webtoon Short Story Contest. He's also the artist behind our logo, and you can check them out in the link down below.
Mike is a brilliant graphic artist, and this work is really a passion project of his, and I really think it actually has a really nice story. So feel free to go check it out. Make sure to like and subscribe the comic if you really enjoy it.
I don't usually enjoy webcomics, but I do like space and stuff. And I actually am probably going to keep reading this, to be honest, which seems a little out of character. But I'm pretty hyped to find out what happens.
All right, everyone. Back to the podcast. All right, everyone. We should have just come back from hearing the wonderful ad about Graphic Ginger and his webcomic Starcrossers. Please go check it out. He's been an amazing sponsor, and we're really happy to be working with him.
I've been happy to read the webcomic as it's been releasing. I'm excited to check it out. I know that they tend to come out at the rate of our episodes, so...
Which is nice, yeah. And it's really nice because hearing other people support him, too, because he's a personal friend of mine, and it's been nice to actually really get to, see the things that he, dives into and spends a lot of his time working on. So
that's really cool.
All right, we're going to move on to Stax pieces and sort of how they shift the political discussion.
So the first one we have is Rule of Law. And one of the interesting things about Rule of Law is it makes disruption way more powerful. So if you see a deck that's playing a lot of 1-for-1 removal spells or counter spells, and they're like kind of dense on that. Rule of Law really helps them out. It makes every counter spell of a Dovin's Veto usually, unless they're using it for protection, and that the team doesn't want it to resolve, because then the other two players can hop into the counter battle, right?
Right. It's a lot easier for one player to be shut down with a Rule of Law effect, because their initial spell is never going to have a backup to it.
Yeah, exactly. It also means that some decks that are like playing a lot of cards like Veil of Summer, Autumn's Veil, Silence, their interaction's kind of dead now, because they can't be used like to protect.
Exactly.
So when letting a Rule of Law resolve, a lot of the times you have to ask the question like, does this affect me more than it's helping me? And that's kind of the political nature of Rule of Law in my experience. It's a lot about asking like, am I okay accepting that this Rule of Law is going to be making my interaction better, or making my protection worse?
One thing to point out about Stax pieces, and we can go on this in another episode because I think we will talk about it at one point, is that Stax can be very, very swaying politically. If you're playing a Stax piece that hits all three of your opponents, now suddenly you're the bad guy. And that definitely can have a tough point in the game, especially if you're not in a place where you can capitalize on that advantage.
Yeah, especially. And there's like a lot of cards nowadays that are playable that used to not be, like Paco and Bruce and Crom, where being the Stax player just sometimes means you get beat to death.
Yeah, very true. I've actually won a number of games with Evolution because myself and the other players have swung at them with our Bruces and our Nagilas, and then, I've been able to go off on my turn because we finally kill them on my turn.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something like to be aware of. I think the most important thing about Stax pieces in general is realizing that if you're on 3 teams and you play a Stax piece and the majority of your teams are hurt negatively by it, if that makes sense, you might have to think twice, unless you think you're more powerful than that opponent who's not shut out of the game.
Definitely.
So if you see someone and they have some value engine that just gets through all your stacks somehow, I mean, like Paco and Halden is a great example of that. They get through everything except for Draenith Magistrate, but sometimes you die. But Paco and Halden notably get through basically everything. It's a big fat beater that kills you, and it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to play through Stax pieces. You might not want to shut out your 2 other opponents, because those opponents are useful in interacting with the Paco deck and make sure the Paco deck doesn't get way ahead. The Paco deck wants to go into the long game. They just want to kill people with their 2020 commander and draw 4 cards every turn.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you're making the game go long, that means there's going to be more turns where they're drawing 4 cards every turn.
I was just in a game earlier where someone slammed down a Trinisphere, but the next turn that came around, everyone had tapped out because they had been using their 3 mana, and I just hard cast a Seedborn Muse. No one had 3 mana anymore. And then suddenly I was taking extra turns basically for every time that the Trinisphere player was even attempting to do anything.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about it, like, you're able to draw cards and make land drops using the Seedborn Muse.
Exactly.
So the player that played the Trinisphere might have just thrown the game in that situation if they hadn't considered how your deck can get through everything.
Exactly. Stax is tough. It's tough.
Yeah. It's like probably one of the most difficult archetypes specifically for that reason. I mean, if you look at like Chains of Mephistopheles, right?
Yeah.
A lot of decks can't beat that card. Medium Green crushes that card. Medium Green makes that card look like so bad. Because all we do is we just loot until we hit our Abrupt Decay, and then we just make land drops for the rest of the game. And then if someone tries to like cast a wheel or some type of effect that breaks the chains in such a way that like you don't win the game, you just Abrupt Decay it, and then it's gone.
Yeah.
The number of games I've lost where someone played a Chains of Mephistopheles in Medium Green is 0. And the number of games I've won is like quite a few. So
yeah.
And the card's powerful. It should be good against Thrasios until you read the second part of Thrasios, which says put the lands into play.
Right.
So the last section of these, like, what cards lead to political discussions usually, this last section is about disruption. And the thing that we've already touched on it quite a bit, but a lot of your disruption, you need to sequence in a very specific way. When you're playing against these cards like Hermit Druid, Ad Nauseam, Underworld Breach, Seaborn Muse, Consecrated Sphinx, whatever. Because you have to sequence in such a specific way, often just these disruption cards on their own lead to political discussions. So some of the top cards in my mind that lead to political discussions that are disruption are Dovin's Veto, Mana Drain, Deflecting Swat. Those are all very discussion based, right?
Right.
Specifically Deflecting Swat, its ability to hit interaction spells so efficiently and and do it without being in blue, which means that you get to avoid like the Veil Summers and the Pyroblasts, is so powerful. And the fact it's free means that people usually don't have it until you slip out the information that you have it.
Right.
So it's very powerful and very important that you explain to other people you have it only in specific situations where it's absolutely necessary. I think politics gets more and more important in this format the more free spells they keep printing, actually.
Very true. Very true.
Because, like, in the past, if someone had 2 blue mana up, you'd be like, oh, they have Counterspell or Delay or Mana Drain.
Yeah.
Now they're like, all right, tap up on turn 3 for my 5-drop. And then you look at their hand with 3 cards in it, and you're like, oh, they probably just have, like, Fierce Guardianship, Force of Will, Force Negation, Mental Misstep.
I did have a game yesterday where someone was like, what are you looking at? I'm tapped out. And all 3 of his opponents at the same time went, that means nothing in this format.
Yeah.
We were all like, come on, you have a full grip. Like, come on.
They've printed 2 free counterspells this like last month.
Yeah.
In the last year, they've printed 3. It's insane.
Yeah,
and we're going to see more.
Crazy.
People really like free counterspells, so it means we're going to see more and more of them. But it does mean you have to give and take and hold information differently. As the format evolves and these free spells get more and more popular, more and more powerful, and they kind of have this influence on the format where people are tapping out more often because they can hold up this protection, and they're also incentivized to tap out because they have to play their commanders to turn them on. Having these conversations back and forth becomes way more important. The lesson here isn't tell your opponents what you have in hand every game. The lesson is don't hold the cards so close to your chest that your opponents punt.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
One thing I want to talk about while we're on the subject is greed. We happens to be at a time, and I've lost games because of this before too, where sometimes we get so focused on the politics and I don't want them to think I have an answer, so I'm going to make an action that would politically sway them the other way around. And sometimes that can come back to bite people in the butt, right? So for example, the other day, I had 4 mana up. I had a Muddle the Mixture in hand, which could have countered an instant or sorcery. And instead of muddling the mixture, because my opponents had a reasonable amount of mana up, I activated my Thrasios and said, okay, guys, I have to reset priority here. Let's see if I can get a free counter spell. And instead, I got a card that I was able to use on my turn. Basically, I was in a bad position, and using my interaction there didn't get me out of that bad position. But because I did not use that muddle, my opponent ended up not having his threat countered, and we ended up losing that game. Now, he had a backup. There were other things in that factor, but had that been, the last counterspell necessary, making a play like that is greedy, and sometimes those plays come to bite you in the butt. So it's important to know that you can go a little too far in the tank on the politics, you can go too deep.
And when it comes to revealing information, one thing I want to say is I would only reveal information in situations where you think if there was a telepathy in play, so like everyone could see each player's hand, you would be in a better situation than you are now. I'd only reveal any information if I truly felt that the revealing of information helped me win. I wouldn't just reveal it to just for the sake of it.
Sure. There have been many times where I've had like a threatening board position, and I've been like, guys, legitimately, I have 4 lands in hand. I'm not going to lie to you. If you assess me as a threat right now, we are going to lose this game. And it has worked.
I had an example of a political situation come up just the other day in a game that's going to be on the Casually Competitive YouTube channel in a couple weeks that I kind of wanted to bring up. A player had revealed that they had a Fierce Guardianship in play. Mm-hmm. And we were at a such point in the game where each player was beginning to hoard resources and try to... We were almost at the part of the game where people would start playing threats, I'd say.
Yeah, and we were all pretty hell-bent. Like, there was only 1 or 2 cards per people's hands. And it was
but there was a lot of card draw going on still.
Right.
There was like 2 Thrasioses in play. There was the Urza. There was a lot of top and shuffling going on. So people were digging quite efficiently. Mm-hmm. And I had an Enlightened Tutor in hand. And I cast the Enlightened Tutor after this person said that Fierce Guardianship was in their hand.
While that was happening, we were having an active discussion of, we were like, first of all, when he first cast it, we said, what do we think he's getting here? X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z. Then it came to the point where we said, okay, well, if he gets something scary, i.e. a Training Grounds, because Braden had like 30 mana at the time.
Oh, yeah. For sure.
We're like, if he gets a Training Grounds right here, like how do we fight over this? We were breaking that down. And then as Braden can break down his thought process.
So I initially, like with the card in hand, was like, this is probably getting a Training Grounds. It seems kind of insane. I have like 30 mana in a Thrasios. It seems pretty nuts, right? I think I actually had like 15 mana. So it would have been about 7 cards to turn on after I played the Training Grounds. However, I knew there was this Fierce Guardianship in hand because they had given me this information. And so I was looking through all the enchantments in my deck and artifacts. I played very few artifacts, which is why I looked at enchantments first. And I found 2 artifacts and enchantments that I thought about putting on the top of my deck. But we were at such an interesting point in the game where people were so ready to start a counter war battle. Like, I could feel it.
Yeah.
I could feel it,
Yeah.
And I realized that the better option was to just get a Soul Ring. And so I got the Soul Ring. I cast the Soul Ring. I used it to draw 3 or 4 cards over the course of the game. But notably, it didn't get countered, which is pretty great. A Fierce Guardianship countering a Soul Ring would be kind of bad.
Yeah.
The next turn, though, it became very important that I didn't get greedy and tutor for the Training Grounds, because Ian then went for a Seaborn Muse. Mm-hmm. So my general feelings on the board were accurate. People were about to start, dropping their win conditions, and I could tell that there was a lot of counter build up going on. It turns out that even though I had protection in my hand to interact with the Seaborn Muse on the stack, I had a Flusterstorm. The fact I didn't bait that Fierce Guardianship was incredibly important, because it meant that the Seaborn Muse just barely was countered. Mm-hmm. And I ended up winning the game just a couple turns later.
Yeah, and with that 2 mana, you had exactly enough mana to win.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like the Soul Ring was like, I had to get mana of some kind. I had to get something that would like produce mana.
Right.
Which is why I consider the Smothering Tithe or the Training Grounds. Training Grounds basically produces mana by drawing so many cards.
Yeah.
But it ended up being very important that I didn't get the most threatening thing in my deck, which was the Training Grounds.
Right.
So some people might say, like, oh, that's a misplay. Like, I should have just pressured the board. And usually I would agree. Making, like an intentional misplay is like always correct. However, in this situation, I wanted my opponents to have the counter spells. I knew something was about to happen. I could, feel it in the air that threats were about to start, falling from the sky.
Definitely.
And so I wanted my opponents to make sure that they didn't feel like they had to counter whatever I was doing. Mm-hmm. And Soul Ring is still pretty good.
Yeah. It ended up being a brilliant decision on your part. So,
and I knew that the Enlightened Tutor in my hand wasn't going to get anything useful anytime soon, so I knew that was the right time to use it. So that's just an interesting example of reading the table, thinking about the politics, and knowing what your position is in that game.
Definitely.
I definitely think it was one of the most important plays in the entire game, even 100%. Though even though Enlightened Tutor for Soul Ring is not very impressive at all. That was just that was a point in the game where if I made a slightly different decision, it would have gone completely differently.
One thing that I do want to talk about, talking about this politics, your knowledge of the game can directly influence your politics. So, for example, Braden and I both spend like a ridiculous amount of time learning about decks in this format. Anytime, and I've pretty much shown it this entire season that I've been playing on the Nexus ranked ladder for the past like month and a half. I don't think I've sat across a deck, or even the ones brand new out the gate. We had talked about how to build them here on the podcast, and we'd listened to other content creators.
Mm-hmm.
And being prepared in a game like that, especially when you're competing for points or prizes or something like that, being able to sit down and say, okay, my opponent's on Urza. There are 2 strategies that they could be playing. They could be playing Polytyrant. So if I see a creature in their deck, I know that they're not going to be playing a Proteus Staff or a Polymorph style build. Or they could be playing, they could just be playing regular UPS Urza. And knowing that will help you so much politically during the game. For example, if you think that your opponent on Urza is not playing Power Artifact and they play a Grim Monolith, then that is not a card that you have to be worried about. However, if you know they are on that plan, that's a card you have to evaluate completely differently. So knowing your opponents, knowing the decks in the format, and knowing what they do can really help you politically, and it really helps when you are vocal about that during a game, right? So instead of having that Grim Monolith come down, and your opponent is playing Power Artifact, instead of thinking to yourself, oh, that's a scary threat, I should evaluate that later, instead opening your mouth and just saying, oh, he's playing a Grim Monolith. Well, we have to look out for Power Artifact or that'll just win the game. Now all of your opponents are focusing, now their attention. It's just like what Braden talked about earlier with picking up the card and saying, oh, that's scary. Genuinely pointing out threats at the table can be an extreme help for you.
Yeah, and it helps like direct attention away from yourself, which is like very valuable. But on top of that, it directs attention onto your opponents. And so it also informs the table. So a lot of times people don't know every deck in the format. And a lot of the time, people are hesitant to counter spells that don't provide information. So a War of Invention in an Urza deck is a card that I've lost to quite a few times because opponents don't respect it enough.
Right.
But if you have a removal spell you can't play right now and you see a Word of Invention on the field, you're probably not going to be able to afford it when the turn comes right around back to you, right?
Exactly.
It's going to get a Static Orb or a Winter Orb, and now you're not going to have any mana.
Yeah. It's the same thing with people who were playing back in Hulk Winter, when people would just neoform their dork and everyone would be like, oh, what's he going to get, a Bloom Tender? And they would every time get a Grand Abolisher and win. Every time.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's your responsibility to say, hey, that is a Grand Abolisher on the stack.
Exactly. Or the same thing with Eldritch Evolutions and Najeela decks. You get to learn that is just a Derevi coming in and winning the game, you know?
Exactly.
So pointing those things out, learning your opponent's decks so that you can point those things out. And when your opponents start to trust you as a resource of knowledge, that's a great place for you to be in. Because if they
That's a huge advantage.
It's a huge advantage, yeah. Because if they start going like, oh, well, Ian's pointed out the threat the whole time, Ian's not going to point out himself.
Hey, you seem like a nice guy. I trust you quite a bit,
Exactly.
Ian.
Yeah.
I see it happen all the time when I'm playing with Ian. Yorko and I were just talking about this today. Like, you have to keep on Ian's back. You gotta, like, anytime Ian says anything, you gotta, like, be like, well, that's kind of right, except Ian's missing, excluding this point where it does this. You have to, like, it's exhausting sometimes to play with Ian because you're like, well, Ian's kind of right here, except he just completely failed to mention how this interacts with this combo in his deck, or he failed to, like, and I'm sure people who are listening to this, who have played a lot of CDH, have definitely they've met people like that. I'm definitely one of those people too.
Yeah.
So it's just a skill that you need to learn. Is
definitely.
Like,
my game has definitely kicked up from 0 to 100 when I learned to sort of play in that light where you can point out every threat except for maybe one that just happens to be a little important.
Yeah, or if someone plays a Stax piece that helps you win and you don't say anything about it, you're like, oh, seems good.
Yeah.
That's usually pretty good for you if no one notices that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's always pretty okay.
I think that's a good coverage of politics and Commander, or cEDH.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us, everybody. We are hitting a lot of our milestones. We are getting close to that 1,000 subscriber point, which is a big goal for us here at the podcast, and we'll have to do something pretty big to celebrate that. We won't say what just yet. But
yeah, I don't know, but it's going to be big.
We are very excited for all your support, and for those who keep listening week after week. We've gotten some really kind words from our listeners, and we appreciate you all so very much. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you very much. And from us here at the cEDH cast, thank you and have an amazing week.
See ya.
Bye.